It is with a peculiar mixture of awe and trepidation that I recount a case of such consequence that, had Holmes failed, the course of British history itself might have been altered. There are many who believe Sherlock Holmes's greatest triumphs lay in unmasking murderers, deciphering cryptic codes, or retrieving stolen treasures. But I, his humble chronicler, must confess that none compare to the singular event I shall now describe. The affair began in the late autumn of 1896, when the air in London was crisp, and the city seemed to shudder beneath an atmosphere of unease. At that time, diplomatic tensions between England and the great powers of Europe simmered dangerously. The empire stood at a precipice, and unbeknownst to the world, the very foundations of the monarchy were on the verge of crumbling. It was on such an evening that a most unexpected visitor arrived at 221B Baker Street. Holmes had been in his usual state of restless contemplation, stretched upon the sofa with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I, meanwhile, had been attempting to read a medical journal, though I found my mind wandering. I had observed Holmes in many moods before, melancholic, irritable, or lost in the throes of intellectual ecstasy, but on that night, he had been particularly enigmatic. The sharp rap of the door-knocker interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Hudson, ever dutiful, soon ushered in a gentleman whose countenance bore the unmistakable weight of grave tidings. The man who entered was Lord Edwin Marlborough, a name known in the highest echelons of government. A man of his standing had no business appearing unannounced at such an hour unless the matter was of dire importance. His eyes, dark with exhaustion, flitted anxiously about the room before settling upon Holmes. "You must forgive my intrusion," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "But I had no choice. The situation demands the utmost discretion." Holmes had risen from his place, his gaze keen with interest. "Then you have come to the right place, my lord. Watson, if you would be so kind as to pour our guest a brandy. He appears to require one." I complied at once, though my curiosity burned within me. Marlborough accepted the drink with a trembling hand, but did not touch it. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a hushed tone, "there has been an occurrence at Buckingham Palace, one that, if exposed, could shake the empire to its core." Holmes, who had been idly tapping his fingers against his forearm, suddenly became very still. Then, "I suggest you tell me everything, my lord, and omit nothing." Lord Marlborough leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It is the Queen. She has—" He hesitated, as though the words refused to form. "She has vanished." A silence followed that seemed to stretch endlessly. Holmes did not so much as blink, but I confess I felt a shiver pass through me. "Vanished?" I repeated. "Surely that is impossible. The palace is one of the most secure locations in all of England." Marlborough exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "And yet it has happened. At some point during the night, Her Majesty disappeared from her private chambers. No alarm was raised, no sign of intrusion was detected. It was as if she simply ceased to be." Holmes had closed his eyes, his fingers pressed together once more. "When was she last seen?" "A little after 11 o'clock last night. One of her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Eleanor Ashford, assisted her in retiring to her chambers. The guards remained at their posts throughout the night. Yet when her maid entered at dawn, the Queen was gone." Holmes remained silent for a moment before opening his eyes. "And what steps have already been taken?" Marlborough shook his head. "None. The Prime Minister himself has ordered absolute secrecy. If word of this gets out, the consequences—" "Yes, I can well imagine," Holmes interjected. "Tell me, Lord Marlborough, was there anything unusual in Her Majesty's demeanour last night?" The nobleman hesitated. "Now that you mention it, Lady Eleanor claimed she seemed troubled." Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. "Curious, most curious indeed." I had scarcely processed the gravity of Lord Marlborough's distress when he uttered the words that sent a chill through my very core. "The Queen has vanished!" I started, scarcely believing my ears. "Vanished?" I repeated. "Surely, my lord, you mean there has been some misunderstanding?" His countenance darkened. "Would to God that were the case, Doctor Watson. But I tell you, Her Majesty has disappeared without a trace from Buckingham Palace itself. Not a single door was forced, nor was a window found unlatched. Her guards, stationed mere feet from her chambers, heard nothing. When her maid entered at dawn, she found the bed empty, the room undisturbed, save that the Queen was simply gone." Holmes had not moved during this revelation, but his sharp grey eyes gleamed with a light that I had come to recognize. It was the look of a mind already racing ahead of the facts, seeking the imperceptible threads that bound them together. "Tell me, my lord," he said at last, his voice smooth as polished steel, "what immediate measures have been taken?" Marlborough hesitated. "None. The Prime Minister has ordered absolute secrecy. If word of this escapes before the matter is resolved, the consequences could be catastrophic." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then we must act before the ripples of this event break the surface." I shifted uncomfortably. "But Holmes, how is it possible for a woman, the most closely guarded woman in the Empire, to simply disappear?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must determine." The full weight of the matter settled upon me. I had borne witness to many cases that defied reason, but none carried such dire implications. The Empire itself rested upon this mystery. "If the truth were to become known," Marlborough continued, "I fear for the stability of the nation. The public must not know the Queen is missing." Holmes, rather than appearing troubled, seemed almost invigorated by the challenge. "Secrecy has its uses, my lord, but it also obscures the truth from those who might uncover it. How long do you imagine you can suppress such an event?" Marlborough exhaled. "Not long. Every minute that passes increases the likelihood that someone within the palace, some servant, some guard, will notice discrepancies, and soon whispers will reach the streets. We do not have the luxury of time." Holmes nodded. "Then let us not squander it. You will take us to the palace at once. I wish to see the Queen's chambers before a single object is moved." Marlborough hesitated, then gave a short nod. I expected nothing less. Holmes rose briskly, already donning his coat. "Watson, I trust you are prepared for an evening's work?" "Holmes," I said, struggling to suppress my unease, "this is no mere murder or theft. If we fail—" His expression was unreadable as he cut in. "Then we shall not fail, my dear Watson." It was past midnight when our carriage passed through the grand gates of Buckingham Palace. The towering facade of the residence loomed against the gaslit streets, its windows dark, its halls ominously silent. The guards at the entrance stood rigid, their expressions betraying nothing, but I sensed an air of nervous tension among them. Holmes wasted no time once we were inside. "Take me to Her Majesty's chambers," he said simply, and Marlborough led us through the dimly lit corridors until we reached the private wing. The Queen's chambers were untouched since her disappearance, save for the intrusion of worried officials who had scoured the room for signs of forced entry. Holmes swept the space with a glance, his gaze falling upon minute details that my own eyes missed entirely. "Curious," he murmured, stepping forward. "Watson, what do you observe?" I examined the room. "Everything appears in place. No broken locks, no sign of struggle." "Precisely," he replied. "And yet something is amiss. Look here." He gestured to the plush Persian rug at the center of the chamber. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then a slight shift in its position, revealing the faintest outline of dust where it had once lain perfectly aligned. Holmes turned, his eyes alight. Something was moved here, and wherever an object has been disturbed, a truth awaits discovery. The hour had grown late by the time Holmes and I descended the steps of 221 B. Baker Street, following Lord Marlborough to the waiting carriage. The urgency of our summons permitted no delay, and as we stepped inside, the horses lurched forward with haste. The streets of London were wrapped in a thickening fog, the gas lamps flickering like spectres along the pavement. Marlborough sat opposite us, his face drawn and pale in the dim glow of the carriage lantern. Holmes, ever composed, watched him with that sharp, penetrating gaze of his, fingers lightly steepled as he considered the matter before us. "Tell me, my lord," he said at last, breaking the silence. "You have provided a most extraordinary set of circumstances, but there are details still wanting. Was there anything at all out of the ordinary before the Queen retired?" Marlborough hesitated. Her Majesty was pensive, preoccupied. Lady Eleanor Ashford, her lady-in-waiting, noted it but thought little of it. The Queen dismissed her at her usual hour, and nothing further seemed amiss. Holmes inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. And the guards? They heard nothing. Nothing. The palace doors remained locked, the sentries at their posts. "It is a confounding impossibility, Mr. Holmes." Holmes' lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "My dear lord, in my experience, there is no such thing as an impossibility, only a truth not yet perceived." The carriage rattled to a halt before the great gates of Buckingham Palace, its imposing silhouette looming before us. I felt a strange weight settle upon me, an unspoken sense that what lay ahead was no ordinary case. Holmes stepped out first, his voice calm yet resolute. "Now, Watson, let us see what shadows the palace may yield." The corridors of Buckingham Palace were eerily silent as we followed Lord Marlborough through the grand halls, our footsteps muffled by thick carpets. At this hour, even the great residence of the monarch had taken on a ghostly stillness, and as we entered the Queen's private wing, I felt an inexplicable chill pass over me. Holmes wasted no time. The moment the heavy doors to Her Majesty's bedchamber were unlatched, he strode inside, his keen eyes darting over every inch of the room. The chamber was untouched, or so it appeared. I watched as he paused by the hearth, his fingers trailing the polished wood of the mantelpiece. "Watson," he murmured, "tell me what you observe." I studied the room carefully. The bed is undisturbed, the furnishings in place, no sign of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. Holmes nodded. "And yet there is something." I followed his gaze to the ornate Persian rug at the centre of the chamber. It had been shifted ever so slightly, leaving a faint outline in the dust where it had previously lain. "A detail easily overlooked," Holmes mused. "Yet it suggests movement, deliberate movement. But why shift a rug in a room where all else remains untouched?" He turned, his eyes flickering toward the small writing desk near the window. Approaching it, he ran his fingers along its edge, then abruptly knelt, lifting a candle from its holder. "One is missing," he said softly. "There should be two, and this one has been recently extinguished, yet no wax drippings remain where they ought." I felt my pulse quicken. "Meaning?" "Meaning, Watson, that we are dealing not with a simple vanishing act, but a carefully staged illusion." Holmes straightened, his sharp gaze resting on Lord Marlborough. "Tell me, my lord, who, besides the Queen, had access to this room last night?" Lord Marlborough swallowed. "Only her ladies-in-waiting and the palace guards. No one else." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Then I fear, my lord, that our culprit is among them." Holmes remained in silent contemplation for several moments before speaking. "Lord Marlborough, I must speak with those who had access to the Queen's chambers last night. Time is of the essence, and I require their testimonies before their memories become clouded or, worse, tainted by fear." Marlborough nodded gravely and summoned the palace staff who had been nearest to the Queen's private wing on the night of her disappearance. A cluster of footmen, maids, and guards assembled, their expressions a mixture of unease and anticipation. Holmes's piercing gaze swept over them before settling on a figure at the back, a woman of graceful bearing and composed expression, though her hands were tightly clasped before her. "Lady Eleanor Ashford, I presume?" Holmes said coolly. The lady-in-waiting gave a small nod. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I was Her Majesty's last attendant before she retired for the night." "Then, madam, your account is of the utmost importance." Lady Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before inclining her head. "I shall tell you all I know." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you may find this instructive. Lady Eleanor will speak, but it is not her words that shall reveal the truth." I saw then what he had seen. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly against her gown, and a faint pallor clung to her cheeks. Suspicion had already fallen upon her, but whether it was deserved or merely the weight of circumstance, only Holmes could determine. Holmes gestured for Lady Eleanor to proceed. She drew a breath and steadied herself. "Her Majesty was in good spirits when I assisted her in retiring," she began, her voice level. "She dismissed me at 11 o'clock, and I left her chamber, as I always do. There was nothing unusual about the evening." Holmes remained unmoving, his sharp gaze fixed upon her face. Nothing unusual. A flicker of hesitation passed across her features, barely perceptible, yet it did not escape Holmes. "Well?" she amended, glancing briefly at Lord Marlborough. "Her Majesty did seem troubled. She was quieter than usual, thoughtful, but she spoke nothing of what ailed her." Holmes nodded. "I see. And tell me, Lady Eleanor, when you left the room, did you close the door yourself?" She blinked. I believe so. Yes." Holmes turned away abruptly. "Believe so, or know so, madam?" A slight tremor betrayed her composure. "I know so," she corrected, though her voice lacked certainty. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "One should always be certain of the last time one saw a queen." Lady Eleanor clasped her hands more tightly. "I have told you all I know, Mr. Holmes. I would not lie about such a thing." Holmes merely regarded her for a moment longer before stepping back. "Watson, take note of this. When a person speaks the truth, they simply state it. It is only when they feel the need to insist upon their honesty that one must begin to doubt them." Lady Eleanor's face drained of colour, and I knew then that Holmes had seen something the rest of us had not. Holmes turned away from Lady Eleanor without further word, as if she had ceased to interest him. Instead, he directed his attention to Captain Harrington, the officer in charge of the guards stationed near the Queen's chambers. "You were on duty last night, Captain?" Harrington, a man of rigid posture and military precision, nodded sharply. "I was, sir. I take my duty most seriously. I have guarded that corridor for 6 years without incident." Holmes folded his arms. "Then you will no doubt recall to the precise moment any deviation in your routine." A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, flashed in the man's eyes. "Deviation, sir." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. I have reviewed the security logs, Captain, and I find one particular anomaly most intriguing. At exactly 12 minutes past 2, you left your post for exactly 12 minutes. Harrington stiffened. I had urgent need to leave my position for a short while, Mr. Holmes, but I assure you, my absence had no bearing on Her Majesty's disappearance." Holmes lifted a single brow. "An absence, however brief, is always of interest when a queen vanishes. And pray, what was the nature of this urgent need?" The captain's jaw tightened. "Personal, sir." A slow smile touched Holmes's lips. "Ah, personal. The single most ambiguous word in the English language." Marlborough interjected with a scowl. "Captain Harrington, you will answer Mr. Holmes in full." Harrington's face darkened, but he nodded. I stepped away at the request of a palace footman, who claimed I was needed at the south entrance. When I arrived, there was nothing there. I hurried back at once, but by then, Holmes's expression grew keen. By then the opportunity had passed. He turned to me, his eyes bright with discovery. Watson, I begin to see the edges of the design. A woman who insists too much upon her truth, and a guard lured away by a false summons. This is no mere disappearance. This was a removal, planned to the minute. Holmes had remained in thoughtful silence after questioning Captain Harrington, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. It was a posture I had come to recognize as a harbinger of revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but resolute. Lord Marlborough, there is mention in the palace records of an unidentified black carriage seen near the palace grounds last night. What do you know of it? Marlborough stiffened slightly. Yes, Mr. Holmes. A palace footman reported seeing a dark carriage at approximately 17 minutes past 2, stationed just beyond the east gate. But no one saw it arrive, nor did anyone see it leave. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. Most illuminating, he murmured. I could not restrain my curiosity. But what does it signify, Holmes? Watson, he replied. It signifies that someone, somewhere, is lying. He turned his gaze back to Marlborough. Was any attempt made to stop the carriage? The guards saw no cause for suspicion, Marlborough admitted. The palace receives carriages at all hours, and this one did not approach the main entrance. Holmes exhaled lightly. How fortunate for the occupants. But Holmes, I interjected, if no one was seen entering or leaving it, why assume it played a role in the disappearance? Holmes shot me a glance of approval. An excellent question, my dear Watson, and one that shall lead us closer to the truth. For what is a carriage, Watson, if not a means of transportation? And what use is a means of transportation that neither arrives nor departs? He turned abruptly to Marlborough. I must examine the precise location where it was seen. We go at once. Marlborough hesitated. Now, Mr. Holmes, it is past midnight. Even so, said Holmes, truth does not keep the hours of man. Come, Watson, we have a ghost to chase. And with that, the matter was settled. The east gate of Buckingham Palace lay in eerie stillness as we arrived. The gas lamps flickered, casting long, wavering shadows upon the cobbled path. Holmes moved swiftly, his gaze sweeping the ground, his every motion purposeful. Here, he murmured, stopping abruptly. This is where the carriage stood. I could see nothing of note. The ground was undisturbed, save for the faint wheel marks of many passing vehicles. Holmes crouched, running his fingers along the cobblestones, then straightened with a quiet hum of satisfaction. As I suspected, he said, this was not a carriage that waited, it was a carriage that was used. I frowned. But Holmes, the guards… Watson, he interrupted, consider what we know. Captain Harrington was drawn away from his post at precisely 2:12 a.m., correct? Yes, I said, recalling his testimony, for 12 minutes. And at 2:17 a.m., a carriage was seen, motionless, at this very location. By 2:24 a.m., it was gone. A peculiar coincidence, would you not say? The realization struck me at once. Good heavens, Holmes! The Queen was not taken out of the palace in that carriage. She was brought to it, already hidden. A rare glimmer of satisfaction crossed his face. Precisely, Watson. Her Majesty did not walk willingly into some unknown fate. She was taken, under the very noses of her guards, carried out rather than led. Marlborough let out a slow breath. Then it was a conspiracy within the palace itself. Holmes nodded. Beyond doubt. Someone on the inside ensured her removal was both silent and seamless. The guards were misled, the chamber left undisturbed, and when the moment was right, he gestured towards the darkened road. She was spirited away into the night. I felt a cold dread settle over me. Holmes, if we are right, then whoever is behind this has planned every detail. They have left no trace, no mistake. Holmes' grey eyes burned with intensity. On the contrary, Watson, he said, turning on his heel. They have left one. They have let me take up the chase. It was nearing 8 o'clock the following morning when I descended the staircase of 221B Baker Street, expecting to find Holmes deep in some fresh investigation of our case. To my surprise, however, I found him seated at the breakfast table, his long fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood, a peculiar glint in his eye. "Ah, Watson," he said as I entered. "Good. I was beginning to wonder if I should have Mrs. Hudson fetch the cavalry." I frowned. "Holmes, you seem in an uncharacteristically placid mood given the circumstances. Have we received news from Lord Marlborough?" "Not from Lord Marlborough, no," he replied, gesturing to the folded sheet of paper resting beside his coffee cup. "But we have received a most interesting piece of correspondence, one which, I dare say, might alter the course of our investigation." I picked up the paper, noting at once the thick, elegant script and the absence of any signature or address. "Seek not the Queen, for she is beyond your reach. To continue is to bring ruin upon the nation." A chill ran through me as I met Holmes's gaze. "A threat," I said. "A warning," Holmes corrected, tapping the edge of the paper. "And a rather artful one at that." "You seem almost amused," I exclaimed. Holmes leaned back slightly. "I am always amused, Watson, when the enemy believes me foolish enough to be deterred by mere words. But what does it mean? It means, my dear fellow, that someone has taken notice of our inquiries, and more importantly, they now consider us a threat." His eyes darkened slightly, and for the first time that morning, I detected something beyond amusement, a flicker of something more dangerous. "Watson," he murmured, "we are no longer hunting in the dark. The prey has begun to circle back upon the hunter." Holmes took the note from my hands and held it up to the morning light. "Observe the ink," he instructed. "Rich, of fine quality, not the usual India black that one might procure from a London stationer, but something more refined." I peered closer. "It appears heavier, more pronounced upon the page." "Precisely," Holmes said. "The ink is iron gall, the kind favoured by continental aristocrats and high-ranking diplomats. It suggests our adversary is not merely a common criminal, but a man of stature, perhaps even of noble birth." I felt a growing unease. "Then this is not merely a case of abduction?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Did you ever truly believe it was?" He turned the paper in his hands. "Now the handwriting. Do you notice the formation of the loops in the letters?" I shook my head. "I confess, Holmes, that my knowledge of graphology is limited." "No matter. Observe. The distinctive downward stroke in the Y of beyond, and the slight curvature in the R of ruin. These are characteristics of a particular school of penmanship taught to the children of the Prussian court." I inhaled sharply. "Then we are dealing with a German hand?" Holmes nodded. "And more than that, Watson. We are dealing with an individual who does not merely wish to frighten us. This is an opponent who believes himself our intellectual equal." For a long moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling between us. Then Holmes rose abruptly, his expression set. "We must pay Mycroft a visit," he said. "If my suspicions are correct, our anonymous writer is not working alone. This is not simply a kidnapping. It is an act of war." We arrived at the Diogenes Club just as the city was stirring to life. The establishment, founded on silence and discretion, was one of the few places in London where Mycroft Holmes could be found during the early hours of the day. Holmes led the way into a private chamber, where his elder brother sat at a polished desk, surrounded by neatly arranged documents and half-finished memoranda. Mycroft did not look up as we entered, merely flicking his eyes towards a sealed telegram, resting on the desk before him. "I had wondered," he murmured, "how long it would take you to arrive." Holmes seated himself without invitation. "Then you already know why we are here." Mycroft exhaled slowly. "The Queen has vanished, Buckingham Palace is in turmoil, and the government is concealing the matter to avoid a crisis." He finally looked up, his gaze sharp. It is a delicate business, Sherlock, and I fear you are stepping onto treacherous ground. Holmes steepled his fingers. Then perhaps you should enlighten me, Mycroft. What do you know? Mycroft tapped the telegram. Enough to confirm that this is no ordinary crime. Intercepted transmissions between Berlin, Paris, and St. Petersburg. Petersburg suggest that Her Majesty's disappearance was foreseen, perhaps even facilitated, by foreign operatives. A chill passed through me. Good heavens, Mycroft, are you saying that this is not merely an abduction, but an act of political subterfuge? Indeed, Mycroft said gravely. The Queen's absence could serve as the catalyst for a diplomatic catastrophe. If it becomes known that the British Crown is compromised, the balance of power in Europe could be irreparably shaken. Holmes leaned forward. And the most damning part of all? Mycroft's gaze darkened. That one of our own is involved. There is a traitor in London, Sherlock, one with direct access to the palace, and he is working with a man known only as the Falcon. Holmes sat back, his face unreadable. Then our adversary is more formidable than I anticipated. Mycroft folded his hands. I suggest, Sherlock, that you exercise caution. This is no longer a mere investigation. It is a game of power, and the stakes are the very stability of the Empire. Holmes merely smiled. Then let us play. As we stepped out of the club and into the bustling streets of London, Holmes was silent, his expression one of deep concentration. At last, as we entered our waiting hansom cab, he spoke. The Falcon, he mused. A name that suggests a man of ruthless cunning, silent precision, and an eye for the slightest weakness. I frowned. You believe him to be a spy? Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. But not just any spy. One whose movements have been shrouded in secrecy. Mycroft's sources confirm his presence in London, yet not a single agent has laid eyes upon him. That alone speaks to his skill. I felt an unease creeping over me. Then how do we find him? Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, Watson, we do not need to find him. We need only make him come to us. He rapped the side of the cab, giving the driver a new direction. We returned to Baker Street. There is a message I must send, one designed to draw our elusive Falcon from the shadows. I glanced at him, intrigued. And what message is that? Holmes's eyes gleamed. One that suggests his plans have been compromised. I felt a sudden sharp awareness of the danger we were in. We were no longer mere investigators. We had stepped into the realm of espionage, where men killed in silence and shadows hid enemies unseen. And now we had invited one into our midst. Holmes's telegram had been sent, its bait carefully laid, but he did not intend to sit idle and wait for a reply. That very evening, we found ourselves making our way toward the London docks, drawn by a lead that Holmes deemed too significant to ignore. A noble woman, Holmes murmured, as our hansom rattled through the dimly lit streets, seen boarding a ship under heavy guard. It is tantalizingly vague, yet it bears the scent of truth. But surely, Holmes, I protested, if the Queen had been smuggled onto a vessel, would she not be halfway to the continent by now? Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, Watson, you think too literally. Consider this. Would a captor so cunning as our elusive Falcon spirit away his prize with such immediacy? Number. He would first ensure that all was secure. If this sighting holds weight, then I suspect the Queen is still near. We arrived at the wharves, where the stench of brine and industry filled the air. Shadows lurked beneath the flickering gas lamps, and from the alleys came the distant echoes of seamen's brawls. It was a place where secrets were traded as freely as coin. A man awaited us by the entrance to a rickety tavern, his figure half concealed beneath the brim of a weathered hat. Holmes approached him without hesitation. You are our informant? The man gave a quick nod. Name's Owen Mercer. I saw her, I swear it. A lady, dressed in finery, but pale as death. She was being led aboard the Victoria, a merchant vessel bound for France. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And the men who guarded her? Foreigners, by the sound of them, Mercer muttered. Not sailors, though. More like soldiers. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. We must find this Vittoria at once. Mercer hesitated. Careful, sir. Someone's watching. Someone who don't want you sniffing about. Holmes merely adjusted his coat. Then let us see if we can draw them out. But even as he spoke, I felt a prickle of unease, as though unseen eyes already watched our every move. We'd scarcely taken more than a few steps when a sudden cry split the air, a strangled, gasping sound that sent a chill through me. Holmes was already moving, darting toward a narrow alleyway just off the main road. I followed at once, my heart pounding. There, lying sprawled upon the damp cobblestones, was Owen Mercer. His throat had been slashed, and a dark stain was already seeping into his tattered coat. Holmes knelt beside the body, his fingers pressing lightly against Mercer's wrist. He exhaled sharply. Dead. I glanced around us, my nerves taut. Whoever did this must still be close by. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, but we are meant to find him like this, Watson. His hand hovered above Mercer's chest, where something had been etched into the flesh with surgical precision. A falcon, its wings outstretched. A grim silence fell between us. The falcon had struck first. Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. This was a warning. Mercer was no threat. He had already given us his information. This was done for effect, to ensure we understand precisely what we are dealing with. I swallowed. And what are we dealing with, Holmes? Holmes straightened, his gaze steely. A man who does not fear killing, Watson, but rather enjoys the theatre of it. He is playing a game with us, and he believes he is winning. A movement in the shadows caught my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. We should leave at once, I murmured. The docks are not safe. Holmes nodded. No, Watson, they are not. But then, neither are we. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent as we left the grim scene behind us. The night air pressed heavily upon us, thick with the scent of salt and refuse from the docks. I could tell by the measured pace of his stride and the sharpness in his gaze that his mind was working at a furious pace. At last, as we stepped into a waiting hansom cab, he spoke. Watson, we are playing a game of wits against a most formidable opponent. I studied him, noting the rare flicker of tension at the corners of his mouth. You believe the falcon to be your equal? Holmes gave a short, humourless laugh. My equal? Perhaps not, but he is a mind remarkably akin to my own, a tactician, a deceiver, one who anticipates the moves of his enemies with startling precision. Consider what he has done thus far. He ticked off each point on his fingers. He orchestrated the removal of the Queen from the most secure building in England, leaving behind neither witness nor evidence. He deceived the palace guards, manipulated Lady Eleanor, and ensured that every step of his plan unfolded with meticulous precision. And when we began to close in, he did not flee. He struck first, ensuring that our informant was silenced before we could learn more. A cold unease settled over me. Then he has been watching us from the start. Holmes nodded. Indeed, Watson. And more than that, he has been anticipating us. He knows that I will follow his trail, that I will hunt him down, and instead of retreating, he has chosen to engage. I exhaled slowly. Then, this is no ordinary criminal. No, Holmes murmured. This is a man who plays the long game, and therein lies our challenge, Watson. We are not dealing with a simple assassin or agent. We are dealing with a mind that understands the very nature of pursuit. For the first time, I saw something in Holmes's expression that unsettled me. Not fear, but a rare and deadly excitement. It has been some time, he mused, since I have faced a foe truly worthy of my attention. I gripped the edge of my seat, knowing that from this moment forward We were walking directly into the lion's den, and Holmes, it seemed, was only too eager for the challenge. We returned to 221B Baker Street in the early hours of the morning, the events of the docks still weighing upon us. Yet rather than fatigue, I saw in Holmes an almost feverish intensity, a mind working at its highest velocity. He paced the room, fingers pressed together, his lips moving in silent calculation. "Watson," he said abruptly, halting before the fireplace, "we must not wait for the falcon to act. We must force his hand." I looked at him, questioningly. How? By feeding him a lie so carefully woven in truth that he will have no choice but to respond. Holmes reached for a sheet of paper and, with remarkable speed, began writing a telegram. "We shall spread intelligence that a key conspirator, one of his own men, has been captured and is speaking under duress. The falcon is too meticulous a strategist to leave such a liability unchecked. He will be compelled to move." I felt a chill at the brilliance of the scheme. But how do we ensure that the message reaches him? Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, we need not reach him at all. He is already watching. His network will intercept the telegram long before it ever reaches its intended recipient." He folded the paper and handed it to me. "Take this to the telegraph office. It must appear entirely routine. Once the falcon believes he has been outmaneuvered, he will attempt to strike, and that is when we shall be waiting." A thought occurred to me. "And where do you propose we set our trap?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The final act of this drama, Watson, shall play out at the old Waterloo train station. An abandoned platform, mist-cloaked and deserted. It is the perfect stage for a reckoning." I swallowed hard, for I knew that once the falcon came, there would be no turning back. That night, under the veil of darkness, Holmes and I made our way to Waterloo's abandoned platform, a place long forgotten by the city, where the hiss of unseen steam pipes and the creaking of aged iron filled the air. "It is here, Watson, that we shall meet our adversary," Holmes murmured, glancing about with satisfaction. "The falcon will not come alone. He will have men, and they will be armed." I felt the reassuring weight of my revolver in my coat pocket. "And yet, Holmes, we stand here with nothing but a deception." Holmes gave a low chuckle. "Not just a deception, my dear Watson. An inevitability." He gestured to the station's dimly lit entryway, where an unassuming figure in the shadows was positioned. "Our bait, Inspector Lestrade's man, will pose as the captured informant. The falcon's men will come to silence him, but when they do, they will find themselves surrounded." I could not suppress a shudder. "And what of the falcon himself?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "He will come last, when all others have moved. A man of his intellect will not enter the fray until he believes the battle is already won. But, Watson, we shall ensure that this time he is mistaken." As the mist thickened around us, I found myself gripping my revolver a little tighter. The final game had begun. Holmes turned to me with that unsettling air of quiet finality I had come to know all too well. "Watson," he said, "I require you to be the bait." I started. "Holmes, surely you jest." "Not in the slightest," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "The falcon is meticulous. He will not expose himself unless he believes the situation to be entirely within his control. We must convince him that his men have failed, and that the so-called informant still lives, prepared to sell his secrets for the right price." A slow dread coiled within me. "And you mean for me to play the part?" "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. "You will take the inspector's place at the rendezvous point. The falcon's men will come expecting to silence a loose end, but instead, they shall find you, alone, vulnerable, and seemingly unaware of the danger you are in." I swallowed hard. "And what of you?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I shall be watching Watson, just as he will be watching you. The moment he believes he has the upper hand will be the moment I strike." I hesitated, but I knew Holmes too well. He had set his course, and nothing short of divine intervention could alter it. "Very well," I said, bracing myself. "If I am to be your decoy, then let us see it through." Holmes clasped my shoulder briefly. "Courage, Watson. The falcon is dangerous, but he is also predictable. His arrogance shall be his undoing." Thus, I found myself stepping into the mist, my heart pounding as I took my place at the designated meeting spot. The darkness pressed in around me, and I fought to steady my breath, for I knew that at any moment the enemy would come. The station was eerily silent, save for the occasional hiss of steam escaping unseen pipes. I stood alone in the dim glow of a flickering gas lamp, my senses stretched taut with anticipation. Then, from the shadows, a voice, low, measured, and unmistakably foreign. "You have information for me." I turned sharply. A masked figure had materialized from the fog, his posture rigid with authority. His voice carried no fear, no hesitation, only the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to control. "I do," I replied evenly, though my pulse raced. "But I do not give such things freely." A soft chuckle. "You are in no position to bargain, Doctor." He took a step forward, and in the dim light, I saw a gloved hand resting upon the hilt of a concealed blade. "I ask only once," he said. "What does Sherlock Holmes know?" A flicker of movement behind him. Holmes, unseen, closing the noose. I met the man's gaze and held it. "Enough," I said. "Enough to bring you down." His body tensed. For the first time, doubt crept into his stance. He had come expecting a desperate informant, an easy target. Instead, he had walked into a carefully laid snare. Holmes's voice rang out, sharp as a pistol shot. "I should very much like to see you try, Count von Eberhardt." The falcon spun. Too late. In an instant, Holmes was upon him, seizing the masked man's wrist before he could draw his blade. A struggle ensued, swift and silent, before Holmes wrenched the mask away. Count Victor von Eberhardt, a high-ranking German diplomat, stood before us, his face twisted in fury. "You," he spat. "You think you have won." Holmes merely smiled. "My dear Count, you mistake me. I have only just begun." The trap had been sprung. The final reckoning had come. The moment the mask was torn from his face, Count Victor von Eberhardt stiffened. The gaslight flickered against his sharp, aristocratic features. His eyes, steely and cold, fixing upon Holmes with something between rage and amusement. Holmes regarded him with quiet triumph. "Ah, Count, I must commend you. Your deception was nearly flawless. Had we not anticipated your move, you might well have succeeded." Von Eberhardt's lips curled into a smirk. "And you think you have won, Herr Holmes?" His voice, even unmasked, bore no hint of fear. "You have merely uncovered the face of the falcon, but do you truly believe you have clipped his wings?" Holmes did not waver. "I think, Count, that you are a man accustomed to controlling every piece upon the board. Yet I wonder, have you accounted for what happens when the game turns against you?" Von Eberhardt's eyes flickered toward the shadowed corners of the station. I followed his gaze, tensing, my fingers tightening around the revolver in my coat pocket. Holmes noticed as well and shook his head with a wry smile. "You are searching for an escape route," Holmes observed. "Quite futile, I assure you. You see, I anticipated this moment. The exits are watched, and your men, those who have not already been arrested, are now being pursued through the streets of London. You are quite alone, Count." Von Eberhardt's smirk did not fade. "A clever play, Holmes, but it is not over." And with that, in one swift and unexpected motion, he struck out, knocking Holmes off balance and wrenching free from our grasp. Before we could react, he had darted into the fog, vanishing into the night. Holmes sprang to his feet, his eyes blazing. "After him, Watson. The falcon takes flight." And so the chase began. We raced into the streets of London, the thick fog rolling in waves across the cobblestones. The Count was fast, weaving through narrow alleyways and darkened passages with the precision of a man who had planned his escape well in advance. Holmes ran ahead of me, his coat billowing behind him. "He will attempt to reach the river," he called over his shoulder. "He has a vessel waiting." Gunfire split the air. A shot rang out from the darkness, striking the lamppost beside me, shattering the glass in a spray of sparks. I dropped low, my heart hammering. "Watson! Keep moving!" Holmes barked. We pressed on, our pursuit relentless. In the distance, I could hear the thunder of hooves and the rattling of carriage wheels. The Count had reached a waiting hansom and was already urging the driver forward. Holmes did not hesitate. Seizing the reins of an unattended horse, he swung himself into the saddle. "Watson, hold on!" Without waiting for my reply, he reached down, and before I could protest, I found myself hoisted up behind him. The horse lurched forward, galloping after the fleeing carriage. The chase tore through gaslit streets, past startled pedestrians and shouting constables. Von Eberhardt's driver urged the horses faster, but Holmes was relentless, narrowing the gap with every second. "Closer, Watson," Holmes called. "If we cannot catch him, we shall cut him off." I saw what he intended. A side street ahead, a sharp turn that would intercept the Count's path. Holmes veered sharply, the horse skidding on the damp cobblestones before regaining its stride. The carriage came into view again, its wheels rattling wildly as von Eberhardt turned to look back. Too late. Holmes urged our horse forward. With a final surge, we rammed against the side of the carriage, sending it careening off balance. The driver lost control, and in the next moment, the carriage overturned with a thunderous crash. I leapt from the horse as Holmes strode forward, revolver drawn. Von Eberhardt lay sprawled amidst the wreckage, dazed but conscious. He lifted his head, meeting Holmes's gaze with an expression of grim resignation. Holmes exhaled. "The chase is over, Count." For the first time, von Eberhardt's smirk faded. Von Eberhardt lay amidst the wreckage, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. A trickle of blood traced a path from his temple, yet even now, in the face of undeniable defeat, his expression bore no fear, only bitter calculation. Holmes stood over him, his revolver steady, his gaze cold. "The game is over, Count," Holmes said. "Your men are scattered. Your escape is forfeit. Speak now, or suffer the indignity of being stripped of all control by those far less forgiving than I." Von Eberhardt let out a slow exhale, his lips curving into a wry smile. "You think you have won, Holmes," he murmured. "But you are still too late." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then she still lives." A pause. A flicker of amusement in the Count's gaze. "So clever," he mused. "So terribly clever. Yes, Holmes, she lives, but for how much longer I cannot say." I felt my stomach tighten. "Where is she?" I demanded. Von Eberhardt did not look at me. His eyes remained fixed on Holmes, as though weighing whether the truth held any further advantage to him. Then, with a faint sigh, he let his head fall back against the cobblestones. Buckingham Palace was too great a risk, he admitted. A ship? Even greater. The Queen of England cannot be hidden in a merchant's hold, not without rousing suspicion. Holmes did not move. Then where? A ghost of a smile played upon the Count's lips. "Where better," he murmured, "to hide a queen than amongst her most devoted subjects?" The realization struck me like a blow. "A convent," I breathed. Von Eberhardt chuckled. "Very good, Doctor. St. Cecilia's convent, to be precise. A small sanctuary, nestled within the quiet streets of Southwark. A place where silence is sacred, where veiled women come and go without question." Holmes exhaled sharply, his gaze sharpening. "And her fate?" Von Eberhardt's expression turned unreadable. "There are some," he said softly, "who believe that the stability of Europe rests on a single sacrifice. And there are those, Holmes, who are willing to see it through." Holmes stepped back, lowering his revolver. "Then we have little time," he murmured. "Watson, we ride for St. Cecilia's." And with that, the final pursuit began. As the clock struck the hour of midnight, Holmes and I, accompanied by a handful of discreet allies, made our way through the shadowed streets of Southwark towards St. Cecilia's convent. The air was thick with mist, the street lamps flickering uncertainly, and a sense of foreboding clung to us like a second skin. Holmes, his face set with grim determination, turned to me. "Once inside, Watson, we must move swiftly. The Queen is still alive, but time is not our ally. Von Eberhardt's associates will not allow us to linger." I nodded, my heart pounding in anticipation. The fate of the British Empire seemed to rest on the next few hours, and I knew there could be no misstep. We were not simply rescuing a monarch, we were standing against a global conspiracy. Holmes had made sure that our entrance would be unnoticed. Several well-placed allies had ensured that the convent's outer perimeter was clear, and it was only a matter of minutes before we stood before the iron gates, which creaked open with a soft groan. We slipped inside, moving swiftly through the narrow, twisting paths. Holmes led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the environment, his mind already 3 steps ahead. His calculated brilliance was as palpable as the cold night air around us. At the convent's rear, we met with a guard who had been bribed by Mycroft's agents. He motioned for us to follow him, leading us through hidden passages that spiraled beneath the structure. My pulse quickened with each step. We were close, but so too was the danger. Holmes paused, holding up a hand. "Do not underestimate them, Watson. Von Eberhardt will not take kindly to his plans unravelling. Be prepared for what lies ahead." We continued, moving in silence, as the distant toll of church bells echoed through the night, signalling the hour. At last we reached the inner sanctum, a secluded chamber at the heart of the convent. Inside, the Queen sat in a shadowed corner, her once regal posture now slumped, her face pale and drawn from the strain of her captivity. I stepped forward, my heart heavy with the sight of her distress. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, but there was no recognition of relief, only the weary resignation of a woman caught in a web far beyond her control. "Your Majesty," I said softly, "you are safe now." The Queen nodded slowly, her voice a mere whisper. "Safe? How can I be safe when my nation teeters on the edge of ruin?" Holmes stepped into the room, his expression steely yet compassionate. "Your Majesty, you have been a pawn in a game far larger than you ever imagined. But the game is over. You will be returned to the throne, and those who dared to betray you will face justice." Her gaze lingered on Holmes, as though searching for something. "How can I trust you?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Holmes's response was measured. "You need not trust me, madam. Trust the law, which we shall now see restored." It was a bittersweet reunion, one fraught with both relief and sorrow, as the truth of her suffering slowly began to sink in. As we prepared to return to the safety of Buckingham Palace, Holmes turned to me, his expression hardening. "There is one final piece of the puzzle, Watson," he said, his voice cold. "The question is not how the Queen was taken, but who allowed it to happen." I was already beginning to understand. "Lady Eleanor," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "Indeed. She was manipulated, blackmailed by von Eberhardt, and led to believe that her cooperation was the only way to save her own life and that of her family." I felt a surge of disgust. So she betrayed her queen, her country, for the sake of fear? "Fear, yes," Holmes replied, "but also greed. Von Eberhardt promised her wealth and power in exchange for her compliance. She may not have believed the full extent of his intentions, but she allowed the Queen to be taken nonetheless. The weight of the betrayal sank deep. A woman of position and honour had been so easily ensnared in the web of a foreign plot. And yet, Holmes had seen through it all. "The worst part of it, Watson," Holmes continued, "is that Lady Eleanor could have stopped this at any point. She chose not to." The truth was chilling. A queen betrayed by one of her own, all for the price of silence. As we made our way back through the streets of London, the enormity of the plot began to sink in. It had never been a simple kidnapping. This was something far greater, more insidious in its design. Von Eberhard was not acting alone, Holmes stated as he strode ahead, his sharp gaze fixed in thought. This was a conspiracy, with implications far beyond the Queen herself. I listened intently. The objective was not merely to remove the monarch, Watson, he continued, but to force England into a vulnerable position on the global stage. A crisis of this magnitude, the unexplained vanishing of a reigning sovereign, would have shaken the foundation of the empire. Whispers of instability would have spread through the courts of Europe, compelling Britain to seek security through desperate alliances. An alliance dictated by Germany, I muttered. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. Von Eberhard knew that with England weakened, negotiations could be turned in his favour. A forced treaty, a shift in power, all orchestrated without a single battle fought. A chill passed through me. Then we were closer to ruin than we knew. Holmes's voice was quiet. A mere matter of hours, Watson, and history might have taken a very different course. Neither of us spoke further. The full weight of what had been prevented was too great to express in words. Dawn had not yet broken when our small party arrived at Buckingham Palace, the Queen once more under the protection of her own guards. The entire affair was conducted in secrecy, known only to a select few who understood the gravity of what had transpired. Holmes, ever the orchestrator of unseen victories, remained at a measured distance as Lord Marlborough and his men led Her Majesty inside. There would be no public announcement, no acknowledgement of the night's events. By morning, it would be as though nothing had ever happened. As we turned to leave, I cast one last glance at the palace's grand façade, its windows dark, its halls still trembling from the spectre of treachery. "You have saved a kingdom tonight, Holmes," I murmured. Holmes merely adjusted his coat. "I have merely corrected a miscalculation, Watson. Nothing more." He said no more, and I did not press him. We returned to 221B Baker Street in the first light of morning, weary but victorious. I had expected some acknowledgement of triumph from Holmes, but he merely settled into his chair, lighting his pipe with his usual detachment. Lord Marlborough arrived soon after, his face still etched with disbelief. "Mr. Holmes, there are no words for what you have done this night." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his gaze distant. "Then perhaps, my lord, it is best that none are spoken." The statesman shook his head. "Surely there is some reward, some recognition you would accept." Holmes gave a wry smile. "Recognition is for those who seek it. I, however, am quite satisfied with my pipe and the knowledge that the world shall remain as it was, for now." He glanced at me. "A most elementary matter of international deception, my dear Watson." As I sat at my desk that evening, committing the events of the past night to paper, I found myself pausing often, struggling to capture the enormity of what had transpired. Holmes had done more than solve a crime. He had unravelled a web of treachery that might have altered the course of history. And yet to him, it had been nothing more than another case, another puzzle to be solved before the next presented itself. I glanced over at him, where he sat lost in thought, the glow of the fire flickering over his features. What must it be like, I wondered, to see the world with such clarity, to anticipate dangers before they could manifest? I knew then, as I have always known, that I would never truly understand his mind, but I would always marvel at it.